Hello, my friend, and welcome to the Sleepy Scholar. Tonight, we are not going to talk about horned helmets and roaring longships crashing through the surf, because, and I promise you this gently, almost none of that ever happened the way you think it did. Tonight's subject is the Viking world, but not the Viking world of movies and cereal box mascots. Tonight, we are going to wander into something quieter and stranger. A 1,000-year-old fog of misunderstanding, slowly lifting, to show us farmers and poets and traders and grandmothers who happen to live in a cold, beautiful, difficult corner of the world. A civilization has been buried twice, once by time and once by legend. And tonight we get to gently dig past the legend. If you've had a long day, this is a good place to let it end. You don't need cosmic mysteries or sheep to count tonight. You just need a low, slow voice and a handful of true, small things about people who lived long ago, sailing gray water under a gray sky. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight. We'll wander gently through the misunderstandings, the myths, the half-truths, taking our time with each one, letting the real history settle over you like snow that doesn't need to be shoveled until morning, if ever. And if these gentle journeys help you rest, you're welcome to like or subscribe, not because it matters to me tonight, but because it might help some other sleepy soul, wide awake somewhere in the world right now, find their way here too. Before we begin, let's take a moment for your body. Let your shoulders drop just slightly away from your ears. You don't have to do anything with them for the rest of tonight. Let your jaw soften. There's a small space between your teeth that doesn't need to be there, and you can let it open now. Let your breathing slow down, not on purpose, just allow it to slow, the way a river slows when it reaches flatter ground. You don't need to remember anything I say tonight. You don't need to follow every sentence or stay awake for the middle or the end. Nothing here is a test. If your mind drifts away and comes back 3 times or 10 times or not at all, that's exactly right. There is no wrong way to listen to this. So let your mind drift as we begin. Here is the first thing almost everyone believes, and here is why it isn't true. Vikings never wore horned helmets. Not once. Not ever, as far as any archaeologist has found, in any grave, in any hoard, in any shipwreck pulled gently from the mud after 1,000 years of sleeping there. The image you're picturing, the fierce warrior with 2 curling horns jutting from his skull, was invented in the 1800s by a costume designer working on a Wagner opera who wanted something dramatic for the stage. That's it. That's the whole origin. A theater costume born nearly 1,000 years after the last real Viking sailed anywhere, somehow became the entire visual identity of a people who never once wore it. Real Viking helmets, the few that survive, are simple, rounded, practical. A metal cap sometimes with a guard over the nose, built by someone who understood that in a real fight, a horn is not a weapon, it's a handle. It's something for an enemy to grab and yank your head sideways. The actual Vikings, whoever forged their actual helmets, would have found the horned version faintly ridiculous. A costume for people who had never held a real sword. Isn't it strange how a single artist's choice in a warm theater under electric light could travel so far and outlive so much truth? Somewhere in your own memory, some small image you're certain is fact might be exactly like this. A costume mistaken for history, worn so long it started to feel true. But that is only one small part of the story. Here is a second lie, quieter than the first. The word Viking was never the name of a people. There was no nation called Vikings. No ethnicity, no single tribe, no flag. Viking was a verb before it was ever a noun. To go Viking meant to go raiding or trading or adventuring, usually by sea, usually away from home for a season or two. A farmer from a fjord in Norway might go Viking one summer and come home in autumn to bring in the harvest, and for the rest of his life, he might never do it again. He wasn't a Viking. He was a farmer who once went Viking. Most people living in Scandinavia during this era, roughly 793 to 1066, if we want a modern historian's tidy bookends, were never raiders at all. They were farmers, fishers, weavers, blacksmiths, woodcarvers. They raised sheep. They argued about property lines. They fell asleep, just like you're falling asleep now, worried about ordinary things, a leaking roof, a sick cow, a child's cough. Calling all of them Vikings is a little like calling every person alive today a traveler, just because a small fraction of them fly somewhere once a year. You too are so much more than the one loud thing you occasionally do. Most of any life is quiet. Most of any people in any century is quiet. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie built entirely on a mistranslation. Vikings did not drink from the skulls of their enemies. This one has a strangely innocent origin, not cruelty. Just a scholar centuries later reading an old poem a little too literally. An old Norse verse described warriors drinking from the curved branches of skulls, and a translator, working long after the fact, rendered it as if it meant actual skulls, turned into cups. But in the older, stranger poetic language, branches of skulls almost certainly meant horns, the horns of animals, curling up from an animal's head the way a branch curls from a tree. Drinking horns, not skulls. So the image of grim warriors passing around a dead enemy's hollowed out head, mead sloshing inside it. That image comes from a translator's small human error, not from any Viking hall. What actually happened in those halls most nights was far gentler. Carved wooden cups, polished drinking horns rimmed in silver if the household was wealthy. Mead and ale passed passed hand to hand, while someone recited a poem they'd memorized as a child about gods or ancestors, or a whale seen once, long ago, off a stormy coast. It's a strange comfort, isn't it, that even our darkest assumptions about the past sometimes come from something as small and human as one person, centuries ago, translating a phrase just slightly wrong. Fear, sometimes, is just a mistranslation that nobody corrected in time. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about violence itself. Raiding was never the main occupation of Viking Age life. Farming was. Picture the actual shape of a year in Scandinavia 1,000 years ago. Spring, planting, lambing, repairing what winter broke. Summer, the short, precious window of warmth used for haymaking, fishing, building. Autumn, harvest, slaughter, the long work of preserving food for the dark months ahead. Winter, mending nets and tools indoors, weaving, storytelling, waiting for the light to come back. Raiding, when it happened at all, was a narrow slice carved out of this larger, older rhythm, usually late spring into summer, when the seas were calmer and the fields didn't yet need every hand. Most Scandinavian households never raided anyone, ever, in any generation. What they did instead was trade furs, walrus ivory, amber, iron, slaves, unfortunately, and honestly. The same as most other medieval societies did quietly, without any of it becoming a Hollywood poster. The raiding gets remembered because the people being raided wrote the history books. The monks who survived a monastery attack wrote furious, frightened, vivid accounts, and those accounts survived 1,000 years, while the quiet accounts of some sheep and stormy weather never got written down at all. It's worth remembering gently that the loudest version of any story is often written by the person most frightened at the time. And fear, however honest, is not the same thing as the whole truth. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about berserkers. Nobody actually knows if they ate hallucinogenic mushrooms before battle, and the more sober historians doubt it. Berserkers were real warriors described in old sagas as fighting in a trance-like fury, sometimes described as fighting without armor, bare-shirted, which is likely where the name comes from. The popular explanation for their strange, frenzied state is that they ate a mushroom called fly agaric, the bright red one with white spots, the one that looks like it belongs in a fairy tale. It's a wonderful, cinematic idea. It is also, most likely, not what happened. Historians who have studied it closely point out something simpler and stranger. Intense psychological states, extreme fear, extreme excitement, extreme focus under mortal threat can produce trance-like fury all on their own. No mushroom required. Some scholars suspect ritual, chanting, or sheer adrenaline. Others think the whole berserker image was already exaggerated by saga writers 2 or 3 centuries after the fact, turning a handful of unusually fierce warriors into a full mythic archetype. The mushroom theory is a much later guess, from the 1700s, dressed up in modern retellings as settled fact. Isn't it a small relief, in its own way, to learn that even the most extreme human states, rage, fear, fury, don't always need an outside explanation? Sometimes a mind, under enough pressure, simply becomes something else, all on its own. The way yours is softening now, all on its own, into something quieter. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about who held power in a Viking household. Women had a surprising, often overlooked amount of legal and practical authority. A Norse wife could own property in her own name. She could divorce her husband, and did, sometimes, for reasons recorded matter-of-factly in the old law codes, like cruelty or his failure to provide. She managed the household's finances while her husband was away trading or raiding, which, given how long a voyage could last, might mean she ran the entire farm alone for a year or more, making every decision a modern farm manager would make. Keys, the literal iron keys to the storehouses, were a symbol of a married woman's authority, and some women were buried with those keys resting on their chest, 1,000 years later still marking who, in that house, held the power to decide who ate what and when. This doesn't mean it was some tidy, equal paradise. It wasn't. And life for most women was still hard, still bound by expectation. But the flattened cartoon version of silent wives waiting at home for warrior husbands misses something true and specific. A Norse woman managing a farm alone through a long, dark winter was doing something every bit as demanding and every bit as essential to survival as anything happening on a ship. Strength, so often, looks like patience nobody bothered to write a poem about. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about a single grave that changed a lot of assumptions. Some Viking warriors, buried with full weapons and the tools of military command, were women. For over a century, one particular grave in Birka, Sweden grave BJ 581, was assumed to belong to a great male warrior. It held a sword, an axe, a spear, armor-piercing arrows, 2 shields, and remarkably, a full set of gaming pieces for a strategy game, suggesting the person buried there had been trained to think about tactics, not just combat. Then, in 2017, DNA analysis of the actual bones revealed something the old assumptions hadn't allowed for. The skeleton was biologically female. Historians still debate exactly what this means, whether shield maiden warriors were common, rare, or reserved for a particular kind of exceptional life. But the sagas do mention them, in passing, the way you'd mention something unusual, but not unheard of. What the Birka grave did, gently and permanently, was prove that at least one real woman really was buried as a real military leader, with real weapons, in real Viking Age Sweden, not myth, not folklore, just bones and iron, waiting patiently under the soil for over 1,000 years to correct an assumption nobody had thought to question. Sometimes the truth just waits. It doesn't argue. It just waits, quietly, for someone to finally look closely enough. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about hygiene. The popular image of the dirty, unwashed Viking raider is almost the exact opposite of the truth. Archaeologists digging Viking Age sites find, again and again, small personal grooming kits, combs, tweezers, ear cleaners, nail cleaners, sometimes even tiny razors, carried by ordinary people, not just the wealthy. Bathing appears to have been a weekly ritual so consistent it left a linguistic fingerprint. The Old Norse word for Saturday, laugardagr, literally means washing day or bath day, and versions of that word survive today in modern Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish. A Viking Age person likely bathed more regularly than the average person in medieval England or France, where washing was sometimes viewed with suspicion by the church. It's a small, almost funny reversal. The dirty barbarian of popular imagination was, in reality, more likely to be neatly combed, clean-shaven, or carefully groomed, and freshly bathed on a Saturday than the people who were writing frightened accounts about them. Even our monsters, when you look closely enough, usually turn out to have simply had a different bathing schedule than we expected. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about geography. Viking Age Scandinavians reached far beyond Europe, as far as Baghdad, and 500 years before Columbus, the coast of North America. Norse traders followed the great rivers of Eastern Europe down into the heart of the Islamic world, trading furs and amber for silver coins minted in Baghdad and Samarkand, some of which have been dug out of Swedish soil, still bearing Arabic script more than 1,000 years after they were struck. In the other direction, Norse sailors following Iceland, then Greenland, then the coastline further west, reached a place they called Vinland, likely part of what is now Newfoundland, Canada. Archaeologists confirmed a real Norse settlement there, at a place called Elant's Ox Meadows, complete with the remains of a small ironworking forge, proof of actual, physical people living there, working metal, 5 centuries before anyone in Europe had heard the name Columbus. It's easy to imagine the Viking world as small, a handful of cold fjords, a few dramatic raids on English coastlines. The real map is so much larger and stranger. A network stretching from the Canadian coast in one direction to the deserts outside Baghdad in the other, all connected, improbably, by wooden ships, and the patient will to keep sailing a little further than the last person had. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about the runic alphabet. Runes were not some secret, mystical, magic-only language reserved for spells and curses. Mostly, they were just writing. Ordinary, everyday writing. Archaeologists have found runic inscriptions that say things you'd find scrawled anywhere people gather. Love notes, boasts, jokes, graffiti carved into the wooden beams of buildings. And in one especially human discovery in Norway, a runestick reading, roughly, Jida says you should go home, believed to be a wife's blunt message sent to a husband who was staying out too long. Merchants used runes to mark ownership of goods. Travelers carved their names into ancient monuments, the medieval equivalent of writing your name somewhere you probably shouldn't. Yes, runes were sometimes used for magical or ritual purposes too. That part isn't entirely myth, but the popular image of runes as exclusively mystical, glowing symbols reserved for sorcerers misses the far more ordinary truth. For most of the people who carved them, runes were simply how you left a note, marked a possession, or told your husband 1,000 years ago and forever that it was time to come home. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about ships. Not every Viking Age vessel was a sleek, dragon-headed longship built for war. The longship is real, and it was a genuine feat of engineering, long, narrow, shallow enough to sail up rivers, flexible enough to bend slightly with the waves instead of fighting them, which let it survive open ocean crossings that would have shattered a stiffer hull. But most Norse ships weren't longships at all. Most were Nars, wider, deeper, slower cargo vessels, built to haul timber, livestock, grain, and families across open water, not to intimidate anyone. A Nar wasn't dramatic. It was practical. It was, in its own quiet way, the far more important ship, because it's what actually carried entire households, entire futures, across the sea to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually that Canadian coastline we mentioned a little while ago. And here's a small, tender detail. When a Viking ship approached its home harbor, sailors would often remove the fierce carved dragon or serpent head from the prow, out of a quiet belief that the spirit represented by that carving shouldn't fright the local land spirits of home. Even the most warlike-looking ships, it turns out, were built by people who believed in being polite to the place they were returning to. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Let your attention rest now, if it hasn't already begun to. You don't need to hold onto any of these facts. They can simply pass through you, the way water passes through cupped hands. Some of it stays a moment, most of it slips gently away, and that's exactly how it's supposed to work tonight. Here is a lie about how Norse society was organized. It wasn't a loose band of equal warriors. It had a careful, layered structure, closer to any other medieval society than the wild, lawless raiders' image suggests. At the top were jarls, something like earls or chieftains, often wealthy landowners with authority over a region. Below them were carls, free farmers and craftspeople, the largest part of the population, people who owned land or worked a trade, who could vote, in a sense, at local assemblies. And below them, uncomfortably, were thralls, enslaved people, often captured in raids or born into slavery, who had almost no legal standing at all. It's an important, sobering piece of the real history. The Viking economy relied on slavery, on ordinary human suffering, the same as far too many economies across far too much of human history. The romantic image softens this away entirely, and it shouldn't. But sitting quietly with the sobering parts of history, without flinching from them, and without dwelling in them all night either, is part of what it means to actually understand the past instead of just decorating it. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a gentler lie, easier to sit with. Vikings had a form of participatory governance, centuries before most of medieval Europe. It was called the Thing, a public assembly, held outdoors, usually at a fixed time each year, where free men, and sometimes free women in certain matters, gathered to settle disputes, pass judgments, and make communal decisions. Iceland's version, the Althing, founded around the year 930, is sometimes cited as one of the oldest continuously functioning parliaments in the world. Picture it: a green, windswept plain, a natural rock formation acting as a kind of amphitheater, hundreds of ordinary farmers and craftspeople arriving from all over the island, on foot or on horseback, to argue, vote, and be heard. It's a strange, lovely correction to the stereotype that a people so often remembered only for chaos and violence were, at the very same time, developing careful legal codes and public assemblies where the loudest voice wasn't automatically the one that won. Order and disorder, it turns out, so often live in the very same century, the very same people, sometimes the very same person. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about the blood eagle, a supposedly horrific ritual execution, where a victim's ribs were said to be cut open and spread like wings. Most historians now believe it was likely invented or heavily exaggerated by later Christian writers, centuries after the events they describe. The blood eagle appears in only a handful of later medieval texts, written by Christian chroniclers, with every incentive to portray the pagan Norse as savage and monstrous. A common move across a lot of medieval writing, where the old religion gets painted as far darker than the new one. No contemporary account from the actual Viking Age describes it. No archaeological evidence supports it ever having happened. It may be a literary invention entirely, a kind of grim medieval urban legend that got repeated so often by so many storytellers that it eventually hardened into something people assumed was documented fact. There's something worth noticing here, gently. The most gruesome, most memorable stories are so often the ones we're least equipped to actually check. It's worth holding your scariest assumptions about history, and honestly, about anything, a little more loosely than you hold the quiet, boring, well-documented truths. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about Norse mythology itself. Much of what you think you know about Odin, Thor, and the Norse gods comes from a single Christian writer, working 2 centuries after the Viking Age had already ended, filtering an oral tradition through his own, very different worldview. His name was Snorri Sturluson, an Icelandic scholar and politician writing in the 1220s, and his work, the Prose Edda, is genuinely one of our richest sources for Norse mythology. But Snorri himself was a Christian, writing for a Christian audience about gods his own culture no longer worshipped, trying to preserve stories that were already fading from memory. He almost certainly reshaped them, smoothed them, reorganized them, maybe softened or reframed certain details to make them more palatable or more comprehensible to readers who'd never sacrificed a single thing to Odin in their lives. So much of what feels ancient and pure, the myths, the legends, the stories you might have half remembered from a favorite film, actually reaches us through a narrow, particular set of hands, filtering, translating, and quietly reshaping as it goes. That's not a flaw exactly. It's just the truth about how anything old survives at all. It survives by passing through someone. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about metalworking. Viking Age Scandinavians produced some of the finest steel swords in the medieval world. Swords so good that other cultures tried and failed to reverse engineer them. These blades, stamped with the maker's mark, Ulfberht, used a purer form of steel than most European smiths could achieve at the time. Steel with far less slag and impurity, likely imported as raw material from as far away as Central Asia, along the same trade routes that carried those Arabic silver coins we mentioned earlier. Modern metallurgists who have studied surviving Ulfberht blades have found the steel quality wasn't matched in Europe again for several centuries. Somewhere along those trade routes, a very specific, very advanced knowledge of metal knowledge modern science, only fully understood using electron microscopes, was already being used by smiths 1,000 years ago, quietly, without fanfare, folded into a sword hilt and handed to a customer. It's a small, humbling thought before sleep. Real expertise so often looks unglamorous while it's happening. No one was writing sagas about the smith's careful hands. They were just writing about the sword afterward, once it had already done its work. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about the diet. The popular image of Vikings gnawing enormous joints of roasted meat, mead sloshing everywhere, misses how much of the actual Norse diet depended on fish, grain, and dairy. Coastal and fjordside communities relied heavily on fish, cod, herring, salmon, often dried or smoked for preservation through the winter. A technique so effective that dried Norwegian stockfish became a genuine trade good, shipped as far as the Mediterranean. Grain, barley, rye, oats was ground for bread and porridge. Dairy was constant. Skyr, a thick, tangy, soft cheese still eaten in Iceland today under nearly the same name, was a Viking Age staple. Made from the very same recipe families have quietly kept alive for over 1,000 years. Meat was eaten, certainly, but it was seasonal and often preserved, not the endless roasted feast of popular imagination. There's something oddly moving about skyr surviving, almost unchanged, in refrigerators today. A small, ordinary food outlasting empires, myths, and misunderstandings alike. Simply by being useful and good, generation after quiet generation. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about ship burials. The dramatic image of a Viking funeral, a ship set alight and pushed out to sea, was exceptionally rare, reserved only for the very wealthiest or most powerful individuals. And even then, archaeological evidence for the flaming send-off, specifically, is thin. Ship burials did happen. The extraordinary Oseberg ship, unearthed in Norway, held the remains of 2 women, likely of very high status, along with an astonishing collection of textiles, carved wooden carts, and grave goods, all remarkably preserved by the clay they were buried in. But these were burials, not always cremations. The ship and the person placed carefully in the earth, sometimes under a mound, not set adrift and burning across open water. The flaming ship departure most people picture, memorably described by one Arab traveler witnessing a Norse funeral on the Volga River, seems to have been one specific account of one specific funeral among a much wider, quieter range of Norse burial customs, most of which, for most ordinary people, involved nothing more dramatic than a simple grave, a few personal belongings, and the people who loved them standing quietly in the cold. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a small correction, easy to make. The treasures found at Sutton Hoo in England, often mistaken for Viking gold in popular retellings, actually belonged to the Anglo-Saxons, a different culture entirely, and predate the Viking Age by roughly 2 centuries. It's an understandable mix-up. Sutton Hoo's ship burial, its extraordinary helmet, its gold and garnet jewelry, all fit so neatly into the imagined aesthetic of the Viking world that the association just stuck in a lot of popular memory, even though the actual burial dates to around 625, more than a century and a half before the Viking Age is traditionally said to begin at all. The Anglo-Saxons and the Norse shared a lot: related languages, related craftsmanship, related seafaring cultures, which is exactly why it's such an easy, forgivable mistake to make. Names, dates, cultures, they blur over enough centuries, the way any small detail blurs the longer you try to hold it in your mind, instead of just letting it rest. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about entertainment. Viking Age households had board games, real, structured, strategic games, not just idle dice throwing. The most famous is H-Nefatafel, sometimes called King's Table, a strategy game played on a checkered board where one player defends a king piece in the center, trying to reach the board's edge, while the other player's larger force tries to trap him. Game pieces, carved from bone, antler, or amber, turn up regularly in Viking Age graves, including, as we mentioned earlier, in that remarkable warrior grave in Birka. Long winter evenings, indoors, by firelight, weren't only about telling sagas. They were also about small wooden pieces, moved carefully across a board by people thinking several steps ahead. The same quiet mental exercise a person might do tonight, right before sleep, without ever noticing they're doing it. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about hair. The wild, unkempt, barbarian hairstyle of popular imagination doesn't match the archaeological and written evidence at all. Norse men and women appear to have been quite particular about their appearance, including, in some cases, deliberately bleaching their hair with a strong lye-based soap. One medieval English chronicler, in fact, complained, with something close to exasperation, that Norse settlers in England combed their hair daily, bathed every Saturday, and changed their clothes regularly, and that this careful grooming made them unfairly, infuriatingly popular with English women. It's a small, almost comic historical detail. Some of the earliest written complaints about Vikings in England aren't about violence at all. They're about vanity and the unfair romantic advantage that came with it. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about where Viking Age Scandinavians ended up settling. Many of the raiders eventually became neighbors, and then, quietly, ancestors. Large parts of eastern and northern England came under Norse control and settlement in a region historians call the Danelaw, where Norse and Anglo-Saxon communities lived alongside each other, intermarried, and gradually blended language and custom. Traces of this blending survive today in ordinary English words: sky, window, egg, husband, knife, law itself, all Norse in origin, sitting so comfortably inside modern English that almost no one notices they were ever foreign at all. The rating, dramatic as it was often just the opening chapter of a much longer, much quieter story. Settlement, farming, marriage, and centuries of ordinary, overlapping life. If you speak English in some small linguistic way, a Viking is already living quietly inside your everyday sentences and has been for a very long time without you ever noticing the guest. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about founding a nation far to the east. Norse traders and settlers, known there as the Varangians, likely played a founding role in the earliest Russian and Ukrainian states, traveling down the great rivers of Eastern Europe, the same river network that carried those Arabic silver coins westward. Norse traders established trading posts and eventually political power in cities like Novgorod and Kiev. According to the earliest chronicles, a Varangian leader named Rurik was invited to rule over feuding local tribes, founding a dynasty whose name, in a quiet linguistic echo, may be connected to the very word ruse, the root of the modern name Russia. Historians still debate exactly how much credit belongs to Norse settlers versus local Slavic populations in this founding. And it's a genuinely contested, sometimes politically sensitive question even today. But the broader shape of it is settled. Norse influence reached far past England and France, all the way into the deep river systems of Eastern Europe, leaving fingerprints on names and nations that still exist right now, tonight, however far away they feel from this quiet room. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about navigation. Vikings likely didn't use a magnetic compass at all. That technology hadn't reached Europe yet, and instead relied on a much stranger, more attentive kind of navigation. They read the sun's angle, tracked the flight paths of land-seeking birds, watched the color and pattern of clouds for signs of land beneath the horizon. And possibly, this part is still debated by scientists, used a mineral called Icelandic spar, a naturally occurring calcite crystal, as a kind of sunstone, capable of locating the sun's position even through heavy cloud cover, by polarizing light in a way the human eye alone can't detect. A fragment of this exact type of crystal was found aboard a sunken, Elizabethan-era ship centuries later, suggesting the technique, if it really was used, might have persisted for a remarkably long time after the Viking Age itself had ended. There's something quietly beautiful about it. Navigating an entire ocean using nothing but light, birds, and a careful, patient kind of attention. The same quality of attention, maybe, that's slowly letting your own thoughts settle now, instead of needing a single bright fixed point to hold on to. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie, small and easy to release. Norse mythology was never one single, uniform belief system, the same everywhere, believed identically by everyone. Regional variation was constant. A community near the coast might emphasize different gods, different rituals, different local spirits than a community inland. Ancestor worship, land spirits, and household spirits existed alongside, sometimes woven directly into belief in the larger gods like Odin, Thor, and Freyja. Religion, for most people, wasn't primarily about grand myths at all. It was about small, daily practices, an offering left at a particular stone, a particular respect paid to a particular place, practical, local, and personal, closer to the quiet habits you might have around your own home than to the epic battles described in sagas written centuries later. Belief, in most times and most places, has always been quieter and more local than the grand version that eventually gets written down. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about justice. When someone was killed in the Viking Age, the usual response wasn't automatic, endless blood feud. There was a formal system for it, called wergild, a carefully calculated payment made by the killer's family to the victim's family, meant to settle the matter and prevent exactly the kind of generations-long violence popular imagination assumes was constant. The value of a wergild payment depended on the status of the person killed. A chieftain's life was worth more in silver than a farmhand's, which tells its own uncomfortable truth about how unevenly value was assigned. But the deeper point still holds. Norse society had real, working legal machinery for handling violence without violence, argued over at those same thing assemblies we mentioned earlier, with witnesses, negotiation, and formal settlement. Killing someone didn't automatically spiral into an endless cycle of revenge. Often, it ended with an amount of silver, a formal apology, and both families agreeing publicly that the matter was closed. There's something almost administrative about it, isn't it? Grief and violence, funneled carefully into paperwork and negotiation. The same instinct that still drives courtrooms today, just with silver counted out by hand instead of numbers typed into a screen. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about how disputes that couldn't be settled with silver were resolved. There was a formal, ritualized alternative to endless feuding called homegang, a structured duel fought under specific rules on a specific patch of ground, sometimes literally a small island, so that the fight stayed contained and didn't spread into a wider, messier conflict between families. Rules varied by region and era, but many versions specified exact boundaries marked by hazel branches, a fixed number of strikes allowed, and clear conditions for when the duel ended first blood sometimes, rather than death. It was violent, certainly, but it was also bounded, agreed upon in advance, witnessed by the community, and understood by everyone involved as a formal alternative to chaos. Some regions eventually banned homegang outright, worried it was being abused by skilled fighters to bully weaker opponents out of their land, which is its own quiet piece of evidence that Norse communities were actively debating fairness, refining their own rules, adjusting their own justice system over time, the way any working legal system slowly does. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about punishment. The harshest sentence in Norse law wasn't usually execution. It was outlawry, being formally declared outside the protection of the law entirely, which meant anyone could kill you without consequence, and no one was obligated to feed you, shelter you, or acknowledge you at all. Full outlawry often meant permanent exile, leave the community, leave the country, and never return on pain of death. Lesser outlawry might mean a fixed term of exile, 3 years being common, after which you could quietly return and rejoin your community, as though the matter, formally, was closed. It's a strange, almost lonelier punishment than execution, when you sit with it for a moment, not a quick ending, but a slow, total removal from every relationship, every safety net, every place that had ever called you familiar. Entire settlements, including Iceland itself in its earliest days, were founded by outlaws, people cast out of one place, who simply sailed until they found somewhere new to belong. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about the sagas themselves, the great sweeping stories of feuds and voyages and heroism you may have half remembered from a documentary. Most of them weren't written down until the 1200s and 1300s, 2 or 3 centuries after the events they claim to describe, by writers working from oral tradition, family memory, and quite often their own creative embellishment. This doesn't make the sagas worthless as history. Many contain real, verifiable details, and some, like the Vinland sagas describing the voyage to North America, turned out to be remarkably accurate once archaeology finally caught up and confirmed them. But it does mean the sagas are best understood as something in between history and literature, the way a very old family story retold at every holiday gathering for 3 generations, slowly polishes itself, sharpens its best lines, quietly smooths over its confusing or unflattering parts, until it becomes something both true and not quite true at the very same time. Every family in every century does exactly this with its own stories. The Norse sagas just happen to be old enough and well preserved enough that we can still watch the process happening faintly at the edges. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about the home itself. The popular image of a Viking longhouse skips over one small, telling detail. Through the long, hard winters, people often shared that single indoor space with their animals, cattle, and other livestock housed at one end of the same building, separated from the family only by a low partition. It sounds strange, maybe even unpleasant, from a modern vantage point, but it was, in its own practical way, an act of care in both directions. The animal's body heat helped warm the human living space through brutal winter cold, and the animals themselves were kept safe from wolves, weather, and thieves, tucked in close where they could be watched and tended without ever stepping into the cold night air. Longhouses themselves were remarkable feats of building long, curved timber frames, walls often insulated with turf, roofs sometimes grown thick with living grass, an entire household's warmth engineered out of wood, earth, and the simple, patient logic of keeping everything that mattered close together against the cold. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about who did the most economically essential work in a Viking Age household. It likely wasn't the raiders at all. It was the women, and specifically their textile work. Producing a single sail for a longship, the large, heavy woolen sail that actually let the ship travel anywhere at all, could take a team of women more than a year of steady spinning and weaving, an investment of labor historians now estimate rivaled or exceeded the labor that went into building the ship's wooden hull in the first place. Wool had to be sheared, cleaned, carded, spun by hand into thread, dyed, and woven, thread by careful thread, on upright looms set up in the same longhouses we just described. Without that sail, no ship went anywhere, no raid, no trade voyage, no crossing to Iceland or Greenland or Vinland. The dramatic voyage everyone remembers depended entirely on a year of quiet, repetitive, almost invisible labor that almost no one remembers at all. It's worth sitting with gently. So much of what makes any grand, memorable thing possible is invisible, patient work that nobody ever wrote a saga about. Yours, too, probably. The unremembered effort is so often the effort that mattered most. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about Norse poetry. It wasn't simple chest-thumping verse about battle and glory. It was built from an intricate, almost playful system of riddling metaphors called kennings, where a poet might never say the plain word for something at all, preferring instead a small, clever puzzle in its place. The sea might be called the whale's road. Blood might be called wound dew. A sword might be called the icicle of battle, or Odin's flame. A ship might be the horse of the waves. Composing skilled verse meant holding dozens of these substitutions in your memory at once, weaving them into strict, demanding poetic meters, all while performing live, from memory, in front of an audience that knew the tradition well enough to catch a clumsy or unoriginal kenning immediately. Skilled poets, skalds, held real status in Norse society, sometimes traveling with kings specifically to compose verses commemorating their deeds. A kind of embedded, live composing historian and publicist rolled into one. There's something lovely about a warrior culture that also demanded, seriously and rigorously, that its most respected voices master metaphor. Even in the harshest lives, it turns out, there was real room reserved for beauty and real respect for the people who could make language do something unexpected. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about money. The Viking Age economy mostly didn't use standardized coins the way we understand money today. It ran, for a long time, on something called hacksilver, silver jewelry, ornaments, and coins from a dozen different countries, deliberately cut into fragments and weighed on small portable scales, valued purely by its weight in precious metal, not by whatever face or inscription happened to be stamped on it. Archaeologists have found Viking Age hoards containing silver from England, from the Islamic world, from continental Europe, all chopped into pieces, all mixed together, all treated as functionally identical, because what actually mattered was the weight sitting on the little bronze scale, not the coin's origin or design. It's a strange, practical kind of economy, one that quietly didn't care where the silver came from, only how much of it there was. A system built on trust in a physical measurement, rather than trust in any single king's stamped promise. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about walrus. One of the most valuable, most sought-after Viking Age trade goods wasn't gold or silver or even iron. It was walrus ivory, hunted and harvested from the remote coasts of Greenland, then carried thousands of miles to be carved into elaborate chess pieces, religious objects, and jewelry across medieval Europe. The famous Lewis chessmen, a set of elegant, wide-eyed medieval chess pieces discovered on a Scottish beach in the 1800s, since become one of the most recognizable artifacts of the era. were very likely carved from walrus ivory, sourced through exactly this Norse Greenland trade network. Entire Norse settlements in Greenland, some of the most remote human communities of their era, appear to have organized much of their economy specifically around walrus hunting, sending tusks back east along the same trade routes that carried furs and amber, keeping a tiny, isolated colony connected to markets thousands of miles away. It's a strange, quiet thought that a small ivory chess piece, carved with such careful, patient detail, might carry inside it the memory of a hunt on a Greenland ice floe, the specific cold of a specific coastline, folded invisibly into something now resting under museum glass. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is one of the gentler lies to end on. The sense of fate in Norse belief, the idea of Urlurg, a person's fixed destiny, wasn't quite the grim, hopeless doom so often portrayed in modern retellings. It was something closer to a quiet, steady acceptance, a way of facing an uncertain, dangerous world without being crushed by the uncertainty of it. Believing your fate was, in some sense, already woven. The old image is of three Norns, spinning and weaving each person's life thread at the base of a great tree, didn't necessarily mean giving up, or refusing to act, or refusing to care how things turned out. For many, it seems to have meant something more like calm, a way of facing storms at sea, or battle, or illness, or a hard winter, with steadiness instead of panic, because the worrying itself couldn't change what was already being woven. You could still act with courage and care. You simply didn't have to carry the terror of the unknown quite so heavily while you did it. That's not such a bad thing to borrow, gently, on a night like tonight. Not the doom part, just the calm part. Whatever tomorrow turns out to hold, you don't have to solve it from here, lying still, eyes closed, at the very end of today. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about the wild frontier image. Some Viking Age settlements weren't rough camps at all. They were genuine towns, planned, organized, densely populated trading centers with straight streets, individual house plots, and populations in the thousands. Hedeby, in what is now northern Germany, is one of the clearest examples. A fortified trading town ringed by a massive semicircular earthen wall, home to craftspeople, merchants, and travelers from across the known world. Its harbor busy with ships carrying goods between Scandinavia, the Frankish Empire, and the Slavic lands to the east. Birka in Sweden was similarly organized, with distinct craft workshops for bead making, bronze casting, and comb production, laid out with enough structure that archaeologists can still trace where different trades clustered together, the way a modern city might have a district known for one kind of shop. These weren't lawless outposts. They were, in their own way, quite orderly places, with local governance, defined boundaries, and daily rhythms not so different from any other medieval market town. The word Viking conjures a ship on open water, alone against the horizon. But just as often, the real Viking Age world looked like a crowded street market, someone haggling over the price of a bronze brooch, a child weaving between stalls, entirely ordinary, entirely alive. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about parenting. Children in the Viking Age weren't treated as small, disposable laborers with no real childhood at all. Archaeologists have found miniature wooden swords, small carved boats, and tiny toy animals in children's graves. Real toys, made with real care, for children who were genuinely, tenderly mourned when they died too young. Childhood was certainly harder. By any modern measure, child mortality was high, and children took on real responsibilities early, helping with animals, textile work, and household chores as soon as they were physically able. But the toys tell their own quiet story. Someone took the time to carve a small wooden horse for a child who would ride real horses one day. But for now, just wanted to hold a small one in their hand. Someone made a miniature boat, not for any practical purpose, just because a small child loved boats, the same uncomplicated way small children still love boats today. Across 1,000 years, that particular tenderness, carving something small and useless and purely delightful, just to see a child's face light up, hasn't changed even slightly. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about the wolf and the raven, two animals constantly associated with Norse warrior culture. They weren't simply symbols of savagery. In the actual belief system, they carried a much gentler, more intimate meaning, companionship, and watchfulness. Odin himself, the chief of the Norse gods, was said to keep two ravens, Hugin and Munin, meaning thought and memory, who flew out across the world each day and returned each evening to whisper everything they'd seen into his ear. Two wolves, Jerry and Freki, lay at his feet. The imagery isn't really about bloodthirsty violence at all when you look closely. It's about a god who needed help remembering everything, who relied on loyal companions to be his eyes across a world too large for him to watch alone, who kept trusted animals close at hand, the same unremarkable way anyone might keep a beloved dog curled up by the fire. Even the fiercest looking symbols, held up to the light a little longer, so often turn out to be about loyalty, memory, and simply not wanting to face a vast world entirely alone. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about craft. Blacksmithing wasn't only, or even mainly, about forging weapons. Most of a Viking Age smith's daily work was devoted to ordinary tools, nails, hinges, cooking pots, farming implements, the metal fittings for a ship's hull, the unglamorous hardware that actually kept daily life running. A skilled smith held real, respected status in the community, sometimes with mythic status attached. Norse legend includes Verland, a legendary smith so skilled his work bordered on the magical. But the actual archaeological record, the actual forges excavated at actual settlements, are full of the residue of ordinary labor. Fish hooks, buckles, cauldron fragments, plow parts. A sword might be the object a smith was proudest of, the piece that got remembered in a story. But a sword was rare. Nails and hinges were made every single week, quietly, by firelight, the unglamorous backbone of an entire functioning society. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about how far Norse settlement actually reached. Once you stop picturing only raiding parties, entire families, men, women, children, livestock, and household goods, all loaded onto those wide, sturdy nars we described earlier, sailed together to settle Iceland, then Greenland, founding permanent farming communities meant to last for generations. Not seasonal raiding camps meant to be abandoned by autumn. Iceland, uninhabited before Norse settlement began around 870, was transformed within a few generations into a fully organized society with its own parliament, its own legal code, its own distinctive literary tradition that would eventually produce the sagas themselves. Greenland's Norse settlements lasted for roughly 4 centuries, farming a landscape that at the time was somewhat milder than it later became. Before a colder climate, isolation, and shifting trade routes eventually led the colony to fade away. Sometime in the 1400s, quietly enough that historians still aren't entirely certain how its final years actually unfolded. It's a strange, almost wistful thing to sit with an entire community, existing for 400 years, farming a hard and beautiful coastline, and then simply, slowly, going quiet. Its ending less a single dramatic event than a long, gradual exhale. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about how Christianity actually arrived in Scandinavia. It wasn't a sudden, forced conversion at swordpoint in most cases. It was often a slow, generations-long blending, old beliefs and new beliefs sitting side by side, sometimes within the very same household, for decades before one side finally, gently, won out. Some of the most fascinating archaeological finds from this transitional period are objects that seem to hold both worlds at once. A small pendant shaped ambiguously between Thor's hammer and a Christian cross, worn, perhaps, by someone genuinely unsure which protection they wanted, or perhaps wanting both. at the very same time, around the very same neck. Kings sometimes converted for political reasons, alliances with Christian neighbors, access to Christian trade networks, long before their subjects felt any real spiritual pull to follow. For ordinary families, the shift likely happened the way most deep changes happen, unevenly, one generation adjusting a little more than the last, old habits fading slowly rather than being torn away all at once. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about falconry and hunting. Norse elites practiced sophisticated falconry, training hunting birds with the same patient, careful skill found anywhere else in medieval Europe. And Norway in particular became a valued exporter of prized hunting falcons to royal courts across the continent. White gerfalcons, hunted from the cliffs of Norway and Iceland, were considered among the most prestigious gifts a medieval European ruler could receive, valuable enough that they appear, specifically, in official gift exchanges between kings, treated with a formality usually reserved for gold or land. Training a falcon required weeks of quiet, careful, repetitive work, building trust between a wild bird and a patient handler, one small session at a time, long before the bird was ever flown free to hunt and trusted to return. It's such a specific, gentle skill to imagine sitting alongside the louder, more violent image of Viking Age life. Someone standing very still, very patient, slowly earning the trust of something wild. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie, small and easily released, to close this stretch of the journey. Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, wasn't primarily a weapon of war in daily religious practice. Small hammer-shaped pendants, worn as jewelry by ordinary people, were symbols of protection, blessing, and good fortune, worn the same casual, comforting way someone today might wear a small pendant with quiet personal meaning, not thinking of it as an instrument of violence at all. Hundreds of these small pendants have been found across Scandinavia and the wider Viking world, worn by farmers, traders, and travelers who likely never swung a weapon of any kind in their entire lives. The hammer, in daily use, wasn't really about smashing anything. It was about feeling held, feeling protected, feeling like something larger and steadier was quietly on your side as you went about an uncertain day, which is, in its own way, a small human comfort that hasn't changed even slightly in 1,000 years. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a small, quiet lie about amber, the fossilized golden resin so often washed up along Baltic shores. It wasn't simply pretty stone. It was one of the oldest, steadiest trade goods in the whole Norse economy, traded so far and so long that some archaeologists trace amber roots back centuries before the Viking Age even began. Amber beads, amber pendants, small carved amber animals. They turn up in graves far from any Baltic coastline. Someone carried them. Someone valued them enough to carry them a very long way. There's something soft about that. A small golden stone, warmed in someone's palm, traded hand to hand across borders and centuries, simply because it was beautiful. And because beauty, it turns out, has always been worth carrying a long way. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about scale. This one, a little unexpected. Most Viking Age raiding parties weren't the vast armies of film. Many recorded raids involved just a few ships. Sometimes only one. A single ship might carry 30 or 40 men. Not an invasion. A gamble. A handful of neighbors, cousins, and friends deciding together to risk a season at sea. It's a smaller, more human image than the epic one. Not armies, just a small crew, a modest boat, and a great deal of nerve. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about silence and stillness, which the Norse understood better than we sometimes give them credit for. Winter in Scandinavia meant real darkness, weeks of it, sometimes barely a few hours of pale daylight at all. And what did people do with all that dark? Mostly, they rested. They told stories. They mended what needed mending slowly by firelight, with nowhere urgent to be. There's a lesson folded quietly in there, if you want it. Long dark stretches aren't only to be endured. They can be rested inside. Let tonight be a little like that. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie, small and gentle, about the sea itself. Norse sailors didn't think of the ocean as simply empty, dangerous water to be crossed as fast as possible. Old poetry treats it with something closer to reverence. A living thing, moody, ancient, deserving patience. The sea decided when you could leave. The sea decided when you came home. You didn't fight that. You waited for it, the way you're waiting now, for sleep to decide when it's ready for you. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is one of the last small lies to release tonight. The popular ending of the Viking Age, a single dramatic battle, isn't quite right either. It faded, mostly. Kingdoms grew stronger. Trade routes shifted. Christianity settled in fully. The old world didn't collapse. It just quietly became something else. That's how most eras end, really. Not with a crash, with a long, slow exhale, so gradual that the people living through it barely notice the world changing shape around them. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here, near the very end, one more small true thing. Most of what survived from the Viking Age survived by accident. A grave undisturbed. A ship sunk in mud instead of burned. A poem remembered by one person, just barely long enough to write down. So much of what we know is luck. Quiet, patient luck. waiting 1,000 years to finally be found. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about hospitality, easy to overlook. Norse law and custom placed real, formal weight on the duty to host a traveler, even a stranger, even in the middle of a hard winter. An old collection of proverbial wisdom, the Have-em-all, sayings attributed to Odin himself, spends its opening lines not on war or glory, but on exactly this: how to treat a guest arriving cold and tired at your door. Offer water for their hands. Offer a seat by the fire. Don't make them ask twice for food. It's such a specific, tender kind of wisdom to put first, before anything about battle or fate or the gods. Whoever shaped those words believed, apparently, that how you treat a tired stranger at your door says more about you than almost anything else you'll ever do. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about time itself in the Norse imagination. The world wasn't expected to last forever, unchanged. There was a foretold ending, Ragnarök, a great final battle among gods and giants, followed, strangely, not by nothing, but by renewal. A new world, green and quiet, rising after. Even the ending of everything, in this old belief, wasn't really an ending. Just a long night, followed by a morning. There is something gentle in borrowing that shape for your own night tonight. Whatever needs to end today can end. Something quieter waits after it. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about memory. Near the close of tonight's journey, the Norse believed a person could live on, in a real sense, simply by being spoken of. Fame, reputation, a name remembered at the right moments. This mattered enormously, not out of vanity, but because it was, in a very real sense, the only kind of permanence anyone believed in with certainty. An old verse puts it plainly: cattle die, kinsmen die, you yourself will die. But a good reputation never dies for the one who has earned it. It's not so different, maybe, from how you'll be remembered by the people who love you. Not by wealth, not by how loud your life was, just by the plain, quiet truth of how you treated people, held gently by whoever remembers you after. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Here, truly near the end now, one last small correction, offered softly. The Vikings were never a single story at all. Not villains, not heroes. Just people flawed, resourceful, occasionally cruel, often surprisingly tender, living ordinary lives inside an extraordinary, difficult world, the same as anyone in any century, including this one. The horns were never real. The skulls were never cups, but the hands that mended nets, that carved small wooden horses for small children, that raised quiet stones for people they missed. Those were real. Those are the parts worth keeping. Here is one more, small and easy to hold. The image of the lone, wandering warrior, belonging to no one, answering to no one, isn't quite right either. Norse identity was deeply, thoroughly relational, defined by family, by household, by the specific web of obligations owed to specific people. Kinship mattered more than almost anything. Who your father was, who your mother's people were, who owed you a debt, and who you owed one to in return. A person alone, cut off from all of that, wasn't free in the romantic sense. They were vulnerable, unmoored, missing the entire structure that made a life survivable in a hard climate. It's a quiet reminder, maybe, of something worth carrying into sleep tonight. Being held by other people, known, remembered, owed, and owing in small, gentle ways, was the actual safety net 1,000 years ago, and in its own way still is. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a very small, very late lie, offered softly before we close entirely. The drinking horn, so central to the popular image of a rowdy Viking feast, actually required a particular kind of trust to use at all. A horn has no flat base. It can't be set down half full. Once it's poured, you either drink it or you hand it carefully to someone beside you. There's no way to hoard a drink from a horn. No way to sip slowly in a corner alone. It's built, almost by its very shape, for sharing passed hand to hand around a fire, again and again, all night. Maybe that's a small, fitting last image for tonight. Something that can't be held onto too tightly. Something meant to be passed along gently and let go of again and again until the night is done. Here is one more, quiet and small, before we truly close. Even the great Norse gods in the old stories needed rest. Thor slept. Odin, despite his endless watching, slept too, trusting his 2 ravens to keep watch while he did. If gods in these old stories allowed themselves that, you're allowed it too. Tonight doesn't need you awake for it. It will happen fine without you watching. There's something else worth resting on for a moment, and then, gently, we'll let it all go. Here is a small one. Most runestones weren't warnings, or curses, or magic spells at all. They were memorials, quiet, formal, often loving tributes, raised by families for someone who had died, frequently someone who had died far from home. Thousands of runestones survive across Scandinavia, and a great many share a similar, tender pattern. So-and-so raised this stone in memory of their father, who died in the East, or in memory of their brother, who drowned, carved by families, who never got the closure of a body brought home, choosing instead to raise a permanent stone marker near a well-traveled road, so that everyone passing, for centuries afterward, would remember a name that might otherwise have simply disappeared. It's such a plain, universal impulse, isn't it, to want someone remembered permanently by strangers who never knew them at all. People 1,000 years ago wanted exactly that, standing at exactly the same kind of loss you might recognize from your own life. And they solved it the same simple way, with a stone and a name and a few careful words. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about motive. Raiding wasn't simply an expression of bloodlust. Much of it was driven by very practical, very human pressures. Political fragmentation, at home, land scarcity, and the simple economic pull of undefended wealth along nearby coastlines. Scandinavia during this period was fragmented into many small, competing kingdoms and chiefdoms, often at war with each other over land and status. Farmland, especially good farmland, was limited, and inheritance customs sometimes left younger sons with very little to their name. At the very same moment, monasteries across Britain and Ireland sat largely undefended, holding valuable silver, gold, and portable wealth, with almost no military protection at all. None of this excuses the violence that followed, but it does replace a cartoonish explanation. They were simply savage, with a more familiar, more human one, desperate or ambitious people, facing real scarcity, taking advantage of real opportunity. The same unglamorous calculation that's driven conflict in nearly every century of human history, before and since. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about clothing. Viking Age textiles were often brightly, even boldly colored, using natural dyes, reds, yellows, blues, greens, nothing like the drab grays and browns so often shown in film and television. Chemical analysis of surviving fabric fragments has revealed traces of dyes made from plants like woad, madder, and weld, alongside imported dyes that suggest a genuine long-distance trade in color itself. Wealthier households wore imported silk trim, sometimes even threaded with real silver or gold, sewn along the edges of otherwise practical woolen garments. A small, glittering hint of luxury stitched into everyday clothing. The gray, muddy, monochrome Viking of film is mostly a costume budget decision, not a historical one. The real version, at least for anyone with a little wealth, would have looked considerably more vivid, more careful, more intentionally beautiful than popular imagination usually allows. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie, almost a technicality, but a lovely one. The word Viking may originally have referred not to raiders in general, but specifically to people from a particular bay or inlet. The Old Norse word, vik, meaning exactly that, a small bay, possibly describing those who would lurk in hidden coastal inlets, waiting for passing ships or opportunities. Linguists still debate the exact origin, and there are competing theories, but this version is lovely in its specificity. Not a grand word for a grand warrior culture, but a small, local, almost geographic term, describing a particular kind of behavior tied to a particular kind of coastline. People who knew the hidden inlets, who understood how to wait quietly in a small, sheltered bay, watching the horizon. Even the biggest words, the words that end up naming entire eras of human history, so often started as something small and local and specific. A bay, a habit, a single behavior, blown up over centuries into something far larger than it ever meant to be. There is something else worth resting on for a moment. Here is a lie about scale, worth sitting with for a while. The entire span of the Viking Age, every raid, every voyage, every myth that's outlasted 1,000 years, happened within a window of time that is, itself, almost unimaginably brief. 270 some years. That's roughly the length of the Viking Age, from the first recorded raid on Lindisfarne in 793 to the Norman conquest of 1066, which historians often use as a rough closing marker. 270 years sounds long, said quickly, but it's shorter than the gap between right now and the founding of the United States. It's a span of time you could nearly fit within 8 or 9 long human lifetimes, laid end to end. And above all of it, above the ships, the raids, the trade routes reaching toward Baghdad in one direction and Newfoundland in the other, the same stars were turning slowly overhead that turn overhead tonight. The same moon rose and fell. The same tides pulled quietly at the same fjords, the same coastlines, indifferent to which century was passing beneath them. Everything human, every fear, every myth, every small correction historians have painstakingly made since happens inside something vastly larger and vastly calmer than any of it. There is something else worth resting on for a moment, and then we'll begin to let it all go. Here is one of the last things worth knowing, and it's less a fact and more a kind of comfort. Your own mind, right now, tonight, is doing something not so different from what those old saga tellers were doing by firelight 1,000 years ago. It's trying to make sense of things. That's mostly what a mind is. A quiet, tireless machine for turning the day's confusing, scattered pieces into something like a story. Something with a shape. Something that can finally be set down and released. All day, your mind has been gathering small pieces, a conversation, a worry, a task left unfinished, the same way an old poet gathered fragments of memory and turned them into a saga to be told by firelight. And just like a saga eventually reaches its final line, and the listeners finally exhale and go to sleep, your mind, too, is allowed to reach the end of its version tonight. It doesn't need to keep composing. The story can rest, unfinished, exactly where it is. There's something else worth resting on for a moment. Here, gently, one more true and simple thing before we close. For all the raiding and trading and myth-making, the actual daily texture of a Viking Age life was mostly made of small tasks, repeated with care, mending a net, banking a fire, checking on a sleeping child, waiting for morning. It's easy to imagine history as one long parade of dramatic events. Almost none of it ever was. Almost all of it, in every century, including this one, is small and quiet and repeated, exactly the way your evening has been small and quiet, exactly the way this next stretch of night is about to be. You don't need to hold onto any of it now. Let all of this soften into impression. The horns that were never worn, the skulls that were never cups, the mushrooms that probably weren't eaten, the women who ran farms and sometimes fought in battles, the runes that were mostly just notes between people who loved each other, the ships that came home with their dragon heads quietly removed. There's no need to hold any of it tightly. It can all blur now, the way a stone blurs at the bottom of clear, still water, still there, still true, just soft around the edges. Let your body settle a little further into wherever it's resting. Let your breathing keep doing what it's already learned to do, slower now than when we began. Let the day, whatever was in it, whatever is still faintly humming somewhere behind your eyes, loosen its grip, one small piece at a time, the way a hand slowly opens when it finally trusts it doesn't need to hold on anymore. There's nothing left to check on tonight, nothing left to figure out. Whatever felt unfinished an hour ago can stay unfinished until morning. The way a longhouse fire is banked low overnight, not put out, just quietly, carefully allowed to rest until it's needed again. Above you, wherever you are, the same slow turning is happening that has always happened, the earth quietly rotating, the stars holding their long, patient positions, the tide somewhere pulling gently at some shore, the way it pulled at fjords 1,000 years ago, and will keep pulling long after tonight, long after every name we mentioned this evening has been forgotten and remembered and forgotten again. You don't have to keep up with any of it. It keeps going whether you're awake for it or not. That's not a sad thought. It's a soft one. You're allowed to rest inside something so much larger than tonight's small worries. Your body already knows how to rest. Sleep well and good night.